The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts Alison and Debi Vandenboom.
Today's topic is voting the entire ballot, and I have with me here special guest Cathi Herrod, who's the president of Center for Arizona Policy. Thank you so much for joining us
Well,
today.
thanks, Debbie. It's a delight to be here.
So Cathi and I have known each other for years, right? And we'll get into that in a second. And Center for Arizona Policy puts out the voter guide that we distribute at church. It's been around for years, and the Arizona Voter Guide, right, where you ask candidates questions and they give their responses. So it's a nonpartisan voter guide that can be distributed in churches, and that you guys put that out, right? Center for Arizona Policy.
Yep, azvoterguide.com.
Perfect. So Cathi and I, like I said, met years ago. I always say that when I first started learning in the political arena, I just followed you around the Capitol. Before you were the president of Center for Arizona Policy, you were like a legislative
council or some title like that.
Some title. And so you were at the Capitol all the time, and I went and sat in on hearings and just got a really good education of how the whole process works. And my kids were really, really little at that time. Now they're all adults. So we won't talk about how long ago that was. But so with this election, one of the things that is so important is that it's not just about president this time around. So many people get the presidential election is important. We all understand that, but that tends to, what I say, it's kind of sucks all the air out of the room, and that's the only thing that people are focused on. And what they don't realize is that if you're a voter in Maricopa County, there are something like 80 things on your ballot.
150 for some voters,
oh my
is what I've
goodness.
been told.
So between 80 and 150, depending on where you live, what your neighborhood is, because there's certain local things that may be on your ballot if you live in one city over another city. But that's a lot of items, and those things are important. They should not be skipped over. They in a lot of cases, we talk a lot on this show about how important those local races and those local offices are, because they have more of an impact on your life than the president, right? And you have more influence on those areas. So I want to kind of tackle some of those things, and let's start with the state legislature. Can you just give us a little bit of insight into how that balance has been so slim here for years, and why that matters from as a Christian, as a believer, as a conservative, why that matters?
Well, sure. In the Arizona legislature, there's the state Senate has 30 members, and the Arizona House has 60 members. And so to pass a bill in the Senate, you have to have 16 votes, and in the House, you have to have 31 votes. So for the last 4 years, the margin has been 31 Republicans to 29 Democrats in the House, and then 16 Republicans to 14 Democrats in the Senate. Now, I'm not talking partisan. I'm just saying that that's what the split is like. And so it's hard to get 31 votes and 16 votes oftentimes in the House and Senate. So that
On anything, right?
On anything, because you don't have, obviously if you're on the Republican side, you have any one member can throw things into chaos when they say, oh, I'm not going to vote for that majority plan or whatever it might be. And so there's not a lot of bipartisan issues in the Arizona legislature often. So who you vote for the state Senate or state House, it has a direct impact on what happens. And on many issues that I think our listeners would hold dear, parents' rights. Are parents going to be free to train up their children in the way they should go? Who you vote for state House or state Senate is going to have a say in that.
Right. And when we're talking about pro-life issues, about school choice, about whether they can perform transgender surgeries on, or whether boys can play on girls' sports teams, all of those kinds of things are decided in a lot of cases at the state legislature. And there have been some really interesting things that have either been blocked. So right now, we talked about this a little bit in the last episode about how there's a split. The parties of the majority parties of the House and Senate are different from the governor, right? So the governor's a Democrat, the slim majority at the House and Senate are Republican. This is in Arizona, not in the national level. And that there have been things that were passed that seemed reasonable and that she vetoed, the governor vetoed. Can you give us an example of one of those?
Yeah, one of the best examples is I had an email from a dad in Tucson whose the mom of their baby had been diagnosed with a baby that had trisomy 18. They had trouble getting medical care, but when Lorelei was born, they named her Lorelei. She was born, she had trisomy 18, but she was doing fairly well. But Lorelei passed away after 8 days, and mom and dad thought they were going to be able to bring her home, and all of a sudden she passed away. So when they found out afterwards was that a slow code had been put on Lorelei's chart, and by a slow code meaning just let her pass away if she gets into difficulty. And so mom and dad were like, how can we stop this? Well, Arizona has had a law for quite a while that if a baby survives an abortion, you have to give all medical means and care for that baby that survives an abortion. So we did and went in to do an amendment. Lorelei's mom testified before the Senate Health Committee to basically say any baby that is delivered alive the medical community has a duty of care to help that child live. So what happened, it passed by the bare majority. With 31 yes votes, 32 actually yes votes in the House. We had one Democrat vote yes. And again, I'm not talking partisan.
Right.
This is just the facts. And then in the Senate, it passed with 16 votes, and then Governor Hobbs vetoed it. And when Governor Hobbs vetoed it, her statement went something like that this is between a doctor and the patient. And you want to say, oh, wait a minute. The patient in that case was Lorelei.
Right.
This was not abortion. This was simply helping this child live. And so
And the parents wanted her
yes,
to have
absolutely.
care.
And she had a chance to survive, and they just let her go. And so obviously the parents were heartbroken. And so we got the law through with legislators that were very supportive. The lead sponsor was a registered nurse, actually, so knew what she was talking about. But then Governor Hobbs vetoed it. So very, very frustrating. And when you talk about, you mentioned earlier a little bit, another example, Arizona law right now says that minors are not allowed to have transgender surgery, that you can't do surgery on a minor to change from boy to girl or girl to boy. However, the initial bill proposal said you also could not give hormone therapy or puberty blockers to minors. And we were one vote short, so we could not get that through. We could only get no surgery for minors. So the vote margins matter, and your vote matters because some of these elections are decided by a handful of votes.
Right, because you're talking about, so the state is divided into 30 legislative districts. And so that area it's bigger in rural areas. In some of the rural districts, the geographic area is larger. But in the city of, in the Phoenix metropolitan area, do you know how many legislative districts are in the metropolitan, do you know approximately?
Probably close to half of them touch the Maricopa County in some way because of how big Maricopa County is.
So that is about 15 or so, roughly. This is not an exact number, but just within the area of metropolitan Phoenix, Tempe, Glendale, Scottsdale, that whole area. That's not a very large geographic area for a district, right? So you do have a lot of power in that, in talking to your neighbors, getting people to vote.
And for example, in Maricopa County, this year, for example, there are 7 state legislative districts that are believed to be the swing legislative districts, meaning they could go, I won't put it in partisan terms, I'll say they could go pro-life or pro-abortion.
Right.
They could go pro-parents' rights, or they could go, well, the state knows better, or the school knows better than parents. Those are the issues that are at stake. And so out of those 7 swing legislative districts, 6 of them are in Maricopa County.
I think one of them is this church. Isn't one of them in this area?
If it's Legislative District 4 or Legislative District 2, yes, many people that go to Dream City will have or in Legislative District 2 or Legislative District 4, and those are very much swing districts. In the example, the pro-life candidate in 2022 lost the state Senate race by less than 1,100 votes. Yeah. That's a very, so you think of this church, the vote from this church could make a difference in those swing districts.
Right, in having a pro-life, pro-family. Because again, some of the things that what you said a minute ago is I think is important to restate, in saying that you have candidates and people in office who think that the state should be able to tell parents what kind of medical decisions they should be making, what kind of school decisions they should be making, that they get in between parents and their kids on all these decisions, and they think that that is right, which we don't, right? Biblically, it's our job as parents to raise up our kids in the way we should go. You said that at the beginning of this episode.
Well, and here's an issue that comes up. For example, should the school administrator or teacher be required to inform the parent if their child is struggling with their gender identity?
Right.
If you have a son who's struggling, should the teacher have to tell you that your son is thinking that maybe they should be a girl? So that was a bill that was on the floor of the state Senate, and one of the senators, stood up and said that a teacher should not be forced to out their student to the parent. So this is where, well, wait a minute, that's not at all what we believe. And
Right.
plus, if the child is struggling emotionally, the child needs help.
Right, and the parent should know.
That's a parent to give, not for a teacher to give.
Yeah, and what we've seen in other states, and we've seen this even with sex ed, right? So you're talking about sex ed as to whether or not parents should opt in or opt out, meaning should parents have to give permission for their child, for their elementary school child to get sex ed, and what kind of sex ed that is. We've had conversations on this show as well about Planned Parenthood style sex education versus abstinence, or talking even just about the biology of childbirth and of pregnancy that's been removed, and a lot of the other stuff has been pushed in there that is trying to confuse kids and get them to be sexually active at a young age, to encourage that. And just so that parents are aware, not to say, okay, that they shouldn't have it or should have it, but that parents should be the ones to decide at when their kids get that and who teaches them. And there's a lot of people at the state legislature, I've heard that brought up a number of times when I've been down, about trying to get sex ed for kindergartners and preschoolers and wanting to push this, and to have parents not be allowed to opt their kids out of it, saying they're forced to have their kids. I've heard that conversation myself at the state legislature.
So, for example, if the legislature were to flip, that's usually the term that's used, to a legislature that is not going to be protective of parents' rights, I can pretty well assure you that they will change opt-in parental consent for sex education to opt-out, meaning that the parent would have to take action to opt their child out of sex education rather than having to give signed written permission for sex education in the public schools, which is the law today. So there's so many issues that are at stake. You know, another one, whether physician-assisted suicide,
Right.
doctor-prescribed death, whether we will join other states around us in allowing doctors to give prescriptions for people to end their lives. Or are we going to be a state that no longer protects life at the end of life? And so there are many issues that are really at stake this election season.
And I've been telling people that not only with Prop 139, which we'll talk about, we'll say something at the end. We did a whole episode on propositions. We've talked a number of times about Prop 139 to vote no on that. But even outside of that, if the state legislature again were to flip, that's one of the things, is the parental consent for abortion. They really want kids to be able to have an abortion without their parents knowing about it. You see it in other states where a school nurse can take a child out of school, take them to Planned Parenthood during the day to get an abortion and bring them back to school, and the parent doesn't even know they've left school.
Well, and when you mention our Arizona Voter Guide, azvoterguide.com,
Yes.
we ask questions to the candidates like, do you support or oppose Prop 139? Do you support or oppose a parental rights type of issue? Do you support or oppose physician-assisted suicide? So that's where then you, the voter, can look and see, okay, here's my belief on that issue and which candidates align with my belief.
Yeah, it's such a great tool. I've been promoting that for decades here.
I know you have. I'm grateful. We're grateful.
Because it is a really good tool, is to see how, because there's a lot of people that want to tell you who to vote for, tell you, direction, but I'd rather empower people to know how to find that information and to look at these candidates and say, what do they believe? And we're not going to always agree. I mean, there are some candidates that got out of the primaries and into the general election who I'm not thrilled with, but are they better than the other person on those issues, right? So you're not going to, I heard somebody say, okay, Jesus is not on the ballot, so you're not going to agree with them 100%. They're not going to be, every single thing is going to be exactly what you want. You have to find the person that is the most closely aligned with your beliefs and with with what the Word of God says, what those Christian values are, those biblical values. We want people that are the closest aligned to that. They're not always going to be perfect candidates. They're going to have some things that they say or do that we don't agree with, but the majority of it are they more on one side or the other?
Exactly.
Yeah, so the state legislature is very important. azvoterguide.com, you can find all of that information. But there are, as we said, between 80 and 150 other things on the ballot this time around. So we did a whole episode on propositions. We don't need to go into all of that, but there are 14, I think, if you're in Maricopa County, because there's 13 statewide and then one county. We said all the 400s are either local or
County or school boards, bond elections, that type of thing.
those kind of
Yes.
things. We've talked a lot about 139. We talked about it here, right? You want to give a quick summary of 139?
Well, just the choice for voters is if you vote yes on 139, you're voting for unrestricted, unregulated abortion, that every individual would have a fundamental right to an abortion. Parents would have no say. Doctors would not be required to be involved in the woman's abortion. A no vote on abortion keeps a 15-week limit on abortion. It keeps parental consent laws. It keeps no taxpayer funding of abortion. It keeps informed consent. Laws that are designed to have health and safety guardrails, basically, for girls and women that are considering whether or not to have an abortion. So it's a no vote on 139 to protect women's health and also to protect unborn babies.
Yeah, and I know firsthand, because I was down at the Capitol for a lot of it, how hard it was to get informed consent for abortion, which seems crazy when you think about it. I mean, if you go to get a tooth pulled, you get a list of information, what's going to happen, what to watch out for, and abortion providers were not giving that information to women. And I anecdotally have talked to so many women who went in to get an abortion and they were told nothing about complications, they never even met their doctor until the day that they had their abortion. And so it's just trying to get things like that to make sure that they meet their doctor ahead of time, that they get information. And that was such a battle. I remember how hard we tried multiple times to get it passed.
It was about a 10-year battle. When you mentioned parental consent even, that it took years to get a parental consent law through, that either the girl gets a court order or she has her parents' consent. But then we find out Planned Parenthood gave a 16-year-old an abortion based on an email that her boyfriend sent from his high school computer. So then you have to pass a law. You have to have a notarized parental consent document. And so, we've had to pass all these laws, and if 139 passes, all of those laws will basically be repealed.
They'll all go away.
Yes.
And I mean, you think about notarized signature. I've had to do that for so many things.
Everything.
For everything. With my kids, I've had to sign for things. Like I said, my kids are all adults now. My youngest just turned 18. But I had to sign so many of those kind of things and get things notarized, permission. It's pretty normal to have to do that. It's not an extreme ask to have that, to make sure that it's actually the parent giving permission, whether it's whatever it is.
So it's like, when you see that ballot, you need to look on the backside, you need to look for the propositions, you need to look for all the races.
Yes, look for everything, because these kind of things are not at the top of the ticket. So all of this stuff that we're talking about is not at the top of the ticket. It's going to be at the bottom of the page or on a back side of a page. So those things are very important to look at. So again, those 13, 14 propositions, we have lots of information about that. We had another episode. You can go back and listen to that. But let's move on to judges. So judges are another thing that takes up a big chunk of the ballot, right? Those are important. We've seen it in Arizona, even with some of the laws that we've had to take before judges to get approved or not approved, and maybe speak a little bit to that about how important judges are just in with our laws.
So we have kind of this merit selection retention system. If you want to understand more about that, you can go to AZ Policy, click on a policy page that talks about judicial elections in Arizona. But what you'll have I haven't counted how many judges, but basically voters, do you support or oppose retaining a yes or no vote on retaining this judge? So the example of what's happening now, we have 2 Arizona Supreme Court justices. Their names are Kate King and Clint Bolick, and there are campaigns to defeat them or to support them. And largely it's born out of an abortion issue, where they did the kind of judicial decision that many of us have longed for, where they're interpreting the law, they're not making the law. And so now there's some who want to defeat them simply because of a ruling that they made. Or as I heard a state representative on the floor of the House say, well, judges are supposed to follow the will of the people. No, that's not what judges are supposed to do. They're to interpret the law. They're not to make the law. And so it's important how you vote on these judges, and it's very hard to get information. At azvoterguide.com, we do, for those judges at Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, we take decisions that they have ruled on constitutional matters, and we summarize that decision. So you can look, the voter can look at, okay, do I agree with that decision or not? So that it takes some work, but that's one way. You can see whether they met the judicial performance review standards. You can get some bio on the judge. So there's more information at azvoterguide.com on judges. But the thing that I would say, and I will just say this in a nonpartisan way, what if a judge doesn't get retained? So for example, in 2022, those who opposed judges who are more conservative defeated a judge by the name of Judge Rusty Crandall. Why were they against Judge Crandall? They were against him because in the Attorney General's office as an attorney, he had written appellate court briefs on the transgender ideology and from a pro-parents' rights point of view and how to interpret the law. So they went after him because of that. He had unanimous scores by the Judicial Performance Review Commission. So what happened when Judge Crandall got defeated in his retention election? It meant that Governor Katie Hobbs was the one who named and appointed his successor. So so those who vote, sometimes people just want to vote no on all the judges because they're frustrated with the system. So the only, I don't want to say warning, but the only suggestion I would give to voters is think about that if you vote no on judges, then it means that that judge will be replaced by Governor Hobbs, who you may or may not agree with.
Right.
And the likelihood is she replaces that judge with a judge who's 20 years younger. And so yes, it's political. It's not just merit selection, but it's just something to think about that, yes, it's frustrating on how to vote on the judges. We give the information that we can get, but just think about that this election year.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And the judges, I mean, we've seen laws that have been passed out of our state legislature that were so important, and the left likes to sue to try to stop legislation from taking place, right? I mean, that was, honestly, we had passed a 20-week abortion ban, and that got stopped by the courts. So
Yes.
we had, years ago, had a 20-week abortion ban that was passed, and the courts just said, nope, it's not going into effect. You don't get a hearing. You don't get anything, right? And it's so complicated to think about how that's even legal to do. But those courts are so important in a lot of those. Do you have any other stories on that about situations where the courts have been really important in why those judges matter? It matters to have good judges in there.
Well, one comes to mind. Some voters might be familiar with Myra Rodriguez.
Yes.
Myra Rodriguez was a woman who worked for 16 or 17 years at Planned Parenthood.
She was a guest on one episode of this show, yeah.
So she was wrongfully terminated by Planned Parenthood because she was a whistleblower. So she filed a lawsuit for her wrongful termination in Maricopa County Superior Court. Her judge happened to be Pamela Gates, who was the judge in that case, and Myra won her lawsuit against Planned Parenthood. So who you vote for on Superior Court, was she going to be a fair judge or not?
Right.
And so in that case, Myra had a fair judge. And the jury verdict came out unanimous for her. So even those kind of things, what's going to happen on Superior Court level? Some of the election integrity cases are decided first by the Superior Court. We're in court right now with Free Enterprise Club on a free speech issue, on an election-related campaign finance issue, where we lost in lower court. We're now at the Court of Appeals. And so who's on our constitutional rights going to be protected? That when you give a donation for a candidate, your name doesn't have to be disclosed. You have a constitutional right, a free speech, free association right to support candidates you choose without the threat of harassment or disclosure. So we're in court now. Those judges that are on your ballot are the ones that are going to be deciding some of these issues.
Yeah, and I think judges are one of those areas where people don't really think about how important it is to have good judges at all different levels, right? You need to have them at the lower courts and the Superior Court, the Supreme Court, all the way up through the federal courts, all of that. I forget, was one of the episodes that we had here, but we were talking about that with Roe versus Wade being overturned, right? That started at the state level. That it was a state legislature that passed a law saying that abortion should be stopped at 15 weeks. And then it was a state attorney general that fought for the law in court.
Yes.
And it got passed up through the courts until it got to the Supreme Court, and that was decided. So there's, people that want to take credit for it just at the Supreme Court level, which was important at the Supreme Court level, but there were a number of other players involved to lead up to that started at the state level, and the state level of legislature, attorney general, all of those things are so, so important.
For example, in that case, it was a judge in Pima County that ruled that, yes, what I call the pre-roll law should be the operative law. And she's being targeted for defeat in the retention election in Pima County solely because of that ruling.
And even with that ruling too, didn't it have to do with standing? They weren't even ruling on the Constitution, like how.
Well, it was on statutory interpretation.
Right.
It wasn't on constitutionality, it was on statutory interpretation and by statutory, which law was going to apply and which one was the one that would go into effect.
And in the law, I don't want to get too far into the weeds because people don't understand all of it, but in the 15-week law that was passed, it very clearly said in there that it was not intended to replace the older law.
So that if Roe was overturned, if the law legalizing abortion was overturned, then our law that said abortion was not legal unless necessary to save the life of the mother would go back into effect. That's what the Arizona Supreme Court ruled. It was the right ruling. The legislature repealed the law. That was under our system of government, that was their right to do so, or their power to be able to do so. And so now the voters have the decision to make on what abortion law is going to be.
Right. And so again, with those, it's like they want to take very simple, like that ruling was pretty straightforward and simple. It was very clearly in the language of the law. So it wasn't even, there was no political nature to that decision because it was very clearly stated in the law. And so then they want to take that ruling, which is actually a really boring, straightforward ruling, and make it into something political and try to get rid of those people because they wanted them to rule politically and say, no, we don't like this law, so we're going to get rid of it, regardless of what is the right thing to do according to the Constitution and according to what the law says.
Right.
And so this is what we're trying to get. There's a whole group of people that are trying to put those kind of judges into office that want to rule and outside of their purview, right, of what they're actually supposed to be doing.
Yes.
Yeah. Anything else on judges before?
No, that's kind of just, they matter.
They matter so much.
Don't just skip over them and don't just vote no on everybody.
Yes. Amen. We need judges that judge rightly.
Yes.
So then moving on, then some of the other things that are on there are school related. So we have superintendent of public instruction. We have a lot of school board races going on right now. So those are also really important. Those are going to be farther down your ballot as well.
So for example, on the county school superintendent.
Excuse me.
People might, who do I vote for on county school superintendent? Well, again, azvoterguide.com has some information on the Maricopa County School Superintendent's race. Why does that matter? If you take Paradise Valley School District, one of the districts in this area, that when there's a vacancy on that school board, it's the county school superintendent that names that replacement. So, for example, the Peoria School District in the last year or so has had a resignation of a conservative school board member. The county school superintendent was the one who named her replacement. He named someone who was not as conservative as the board member who resigned. And so that's why it matters. That county school superintendent is going to fill vacancies. So that matters. We have in some of the school districts, you take Peoria and Scottsdale both come to mind. Paradise Valley, I know, has a race. So you've got contested races for those school board positions. Why does that matter? Because I will tell you that on some of those school boards, there may be 5 members on the school board, and right now they have 2 conservatives that are going to look out for parental rights, are concerned about what's being taught in the curriculum, who are going to focus on what needs to be taught at school and not bringing in a lot of things that parents might not agree with. So there are contested races in those districts because they may be on the verge to flipping from 2 conservatives out of 5 to having 3 conservatives out of 5 or 4 conservatives out of 5. So I think parents, we know, are very concerned about what's going on in the schools. This is an opportunity with your vote to say you want your school district to be more respectful of parental rights.
And school districts are very local races, right?
Yes.
So when you're voting for a school district, those, again, that's toward the bottom of the ballot. And I think that the teachers' unions and they get out the vote, right? They get the people to go out and vote for the more liberal candidates that are on there. And people that are conservative tend to skip a lot of those things and not fill them in, or because they don't know, they're not paying attention, which again, you don't want to just vote blindly and not know who you're voting for. But that information are those in your voter guide?
Well, we asked school board candidates questions, and they didn't all respond. But what we do is we list endorsements. So if you've got school board candidates on your ballot, you can go to azvoterguide.com, you can put in their name under school boards, and you can find out, for example, did Save Our Schools endorse this candidate, or did Arizona Women of Action endorse this candidate? And then if you want to know more about those two groups, well, Save Our Schools is more on the liberal side, Arizona Women of Action is more on the pro-parents' rights conservative side. So that just gives you a little bit of indication. You can, another bit of information, you can go to azaction.org, our more political arm, and you can put in the school board candidate's name and find out, well, did they give money to another candidate? So if you see a candidate for school board who gave money to, say, a more liberal candidate for governor or something like that, and you get that information, okay, I know where that candidate's coming from because they put their treasure where their heart is.
Right.
And so there's information like that. It takes some work, but at least when we put endorsements on the website, it helps in there. It's nonpartisan. We're not saying yay or nay who to vote for, but it gives you an indication of organizations that you can trust and whether they opposed or supported that candidate.
Right. And both of those, when you were talking about was it the
Save Our Schools or Arizona Women of Action.
Right. So Save Our Schools and Arizona Women of Action, both of those groups also have on their websites lists of candidates that endorse. Like one of the things that I have done in the past is even look to see, so if I'm wanting to know on the life issue, I will look on Planned Parenthood's website and see who they're endorsing, because a lot of the even local candidates will be in some school board candidates will be endorsed by Planned Parenthood. They have in years past.
Absolutely.
And that's a good place to see, okay, I don't want that person in there.
Right.
Right? Because if they're being endorsed by a group that you completely disagree with, then that's a good indicator of what they're going to, if they're being endorsed, then they think that they're going to be voting for things that they approve of, which is going to be contrary to what I believe in, right?
Yes.
So those are all really good ways to kind of look up some of these candidates and see which groups are endorsing and find out, because those are nonpartisan races. So the state legislature, there's nothing for governor or for attorney general this year, but president and senator, U.S. senator, Congress, U.S. Congress, and then all the state legislature, state Senate, those are all going to have a letter next to them that says whether they're Republican or Democrat or a third party. Right. And so those are a little bit easier, I think, for people to figure out which ones they like. But then the school board and the city council, they don't have a party listed. They're nonpartisan. Community college board is another one that they don't have a letter next to them. So those are what we're talking about, where you need to do a little bit more research. There are tools that make it fairly easy to find. It does take a little bit of work, but those are very local and very important. And so don't skip those. You have time to go, because you have time before the election. Even if you're mailing in a ballot, the ballots get mailed out to you on October 9th, and then they need to be returned back by October 20, what do we say?
October 28th, a full week before the November election. And one piece of advice for voters this time, because the ballot is long, if you are an early voter, fill out your ballot and turn it in. For those who want to vote on Election Day, even with something like 240 voting locations in Maricopa County, there are likely to be lines, because it's going to take you 30 minutes, however long it might take someone to fill out a ballot. So if you have an early ballot, fill it out, get it in. It's your choice whether you mail it in or walk it into what's an early voting center. And for those who complain about the phone calls and the mail they get and all that kind of stuff, the earlier you turn your vote in, the phone calls, the mails, all of that will stop, because no campaign is going to try to reach you to get your vote if you have already voted.
Because they have lists, so they'll know.
They know every week or every few days they get a list, so they will know that you've already turned in your ballot. So then that way you won't still get, for the next 4 weeks or whatever, you will not still be getting mail.
And if you turn in, if you do get a mail-in ballot and you turn that in, you can track it to see that it arrived and was counted. A lot of people don't know that. On the Maricopa County website, my.arizona.vote is another
Right.
place. Is there
Yeah,
another?
Be Ballot Ready is the Maricopa County website, and then what?
My.arizona.vote is another one, and you can track your early ballot. So when you mail it in, because people get concerned, understandably, right? They're concerned that their ballot doesn't make it, but it'll show you that it arrived, when it arrives, when it gets counted. If there's a problem with it, they couldn't verify your signature or whatever. So it is important to put your phone number on there and to make sure that you check to just verify that your ballot got there and there were no problems with it.
And if you want to know more about that process, if you go to azpolicy.org, our 5 Minutes for Families from Friday, October, whatever that, losing what the date was, October 3rd or whatever, we laid out what the process is for how ballots are tabulated, what the process is within Maricopa County. So if you want to understand more about that, I would recommend that.
Perfect. That's wonderful. Yeah, because there's just so many different moving parts to all of this, and people do get overwhelmed, they get confused. Also, one thing that I always tell people that they're not aware of is that if you do go in person to vote, right, you can go early. So there are going to be early voting centers that open on the 9th, and you can look those up, again, at my.arizona.vote. That's one place where you can look and find early polling locations to go vote early, so you're not fighting the lines. They do tend to be a farther drive, but in my mind, that's worth it to go a little bit early and get that done and make sure that you're good. And you can take in a cheat sheet of your own. Like, you can
Yes.
write things down, take notes. You don't have to remember all of this when you go in. You can write down what you want to vote on all the ballots. You can print out an example ballot and fill in your own things, and then just use that to fill out your ballot so that you're not in there, maybe it's 15 minutes rather than 30 minutes.
Or feeling pressed because people are
Right.
waiting.
Yes.
So you can take your time filling out your ballot as well.
Yes, and then you don't have to worry about forgetting something or forgetting a number or a person's name. You're allowed to take all those notes in with you when you can take your voter guide in. You can take whatever, a list of propositions, any of those kinds of notes in with you when you go vote. So, and is there anything else that you can think of that we have not covered?
I would say don't overlook county races.
Yes.
So, for example, County Board of Supervisors.
Yes.
The County Board of Supervisors, if they were controlled by pro-choice or pro-abortion people, they could say that the county's going to pay for abortions, that the county's going to require the county hospital to perform abortions. So, even what county supervisors, there are 5 of them, there are 5 districts, what they do matters as well. The county attorney, I would mention that there's been a concerted effort for the last 2 or 3 election cycles for the left to take over county attorney positions. So there's a race between the incumbent county attorney and a challenger. The incumbent county attorney, you can look up how she answered questions, again, at azvoterguide.com. But those are important. Those are very important positions. What's going to happen on prosecuting pornographers, for example? What's going to happen on prosecuting those who abuse children? It matters who the county attorney is. So don't overlook those races either.
And because the county attorney decides whether or not they're going to take cases, right? So they
Yes.
decide whether or not they're going to prosecute a child pornographer or somebody that's, those kind of things. They make those decisions, so those rules are very important.
Yes, they have prosecutorial discretion. And a lot of times it's based on whether they think they have enough evidence and can win in court. And so you want somebody who's, is going to approach it fair-minded and look at the evidence and decide and not hesitate from going after a hard case simply because of whatever.
And we have seen both at like the state attorney general or county attorney in other states too, where there's been corrupt things going on in the abortion industry between government officials and universities and abortion clinics, and those attorneys decide, oh, I'm not going to prosecute that. We're just going to pretend it didn't happen, and they don't. Justice is not served, whether they're election cases or all kinds of different cases that the county attorneys as well as the judges, those rules are very important. And another thing with those kind of smaller, they're not as high profile, let's say. It's not that they're small because they're extremely important, but those less high profile elected positions, what happens is that people with higher aspirations will get into some of these lower things, lower offices that are not as high profile and get some notoriety, get some name recognition, and then go on to, be in the state the U.S. Congress. We've got some right now that started off as,
Well, so sometimes I get asked, so why are you asking a question of a county candidate or a school board candidate of an issue like on abortion, that they say the county might try to, or city candidate might say, well, we don't deal with abortion. Well, no, but it says a lot about your worldview. It says a lot about your character, about where you're coming from. And we'd rather have people in all of these offices who are going to have character and have a worldview that protects parents, protects unborn children, protects women, protects families, then because they will go for higher office.
They'll go from one office to another office to another office and use that as a springboard. So all of those things are important. There's a lot on your ballot. You can go back and listen. We've given you some good resources to go find information. So this has been great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I appreciate it so much, your years of expertise, and just this conversation's been
Fun
really
to be on. Thank you.
So thank you for joining us I can't talk right now. I lost my words. Thank you for joining us into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify and follow us on social media. Find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.